Hi, Peter Wielhouwer here. I want to talk today about Congress, the role of political parties in Congress, and the extent to which polarization between those two parties has increased over the last several decades. First, I think it's important for us to remember that party control of institutions of Congress and for the government as a whole matters a lot. When we look at sophisticated analyses of the political parties, we find out that one of the most important factors in the way that members of Congress vote is their party affiliation, and that they're fairly unified in the way that they vote. Therefore, whichever party controls a particular chamber of Congress matters a lot for the kind of legislation those chambers will produce. Without oversimplifying things too much, Democrats these days tend to produce liberal bills, and Republicans these days tend to produce conservative bills. That's not really rocket science, but it matters a lot, especially when we consider when we have different patterns of party control of the institutions in Congress. So again, we have two chambers in Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. When the same party has a majority in both House and the Senate, this leads to broader, more ideologically cohesive legislation being passed. So a liberal party in the House produces liberal legislation, a liberal party in the Senate does the same, and therefore it's going to be more ideologically coherent and cohesive and hang together a little bit better. Same thing if you have a conservative party, the Republicans, that control both the House and the Senate. On the other hand, it's frequently the case these days when we have actually divided control between the House and the Senate. That's where one party controls one chamber and the other party controls the other chamber. I'm recording this in 2020, and currently the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democratic Party, and the Senate is controlled by the Republican Party. Now, this is not that unusual these days, but it does make a difference in terms of the kinds of legislation that takes place. In the best case scenario, the parties in each chamber will produce legislation in which compromise can be found. Consider a liberal legislation being produced by one chamber, conservative legislation being produced by another chamber. When we look at those two bills, are there grounds for compromise? Are there ways in which the leaders involved are willing to give a little bit based on to come away from the ideological positions that they've used that they've used to produce the legislation in their chamber? That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is where the parties in each chamber produce legislation aligning with their own ideologies, but then when it comes to compromising to produce a piece of legislation, they refuse to do so. Neither side is willing to give, or one side is unwilling to compromise with the other side. This produces the worst kind of gridlock. So some people think that gridlock is inherently bad. I don't necessarily think that it's inherently bad. I think that it's part of the reason that we have separation of powers, checks and balances within Congress. But if neither side can agree to compromise a bit in terms of what they pursue, then we end up with a situation in which sometimes laws really do need to be passed, new programs do need to be implemented, and it can't get done very effectively. On the other hand, we can see that even when we have extremely polarized, extremely uncooperative, uncompromising parties, that sometimes legislation that's important does get passed. So again, I'm recording this in 2020, and we are experiencing the current COVID-19 virus shutdown, and people all over the country, all over the world, are being told to shelter in place, to stay at home. And Congress recently produced a large-scale bill that was passed with large majorities of both parties, in which there was a broad array of efforts trying to stabilize the economy and provide economic support for people that are suffering or dealing with the issues related to the shutdown and the economic impacts of it. So this was a relatively unusual case these days, in which you have a very important kind of crisis moment that actually leads to cooperation between parties that historically over the last few years have not been terribly cooperative or willing to compromise with each other. All of this gets complicated when there's a party, the party of the president is one of the two parties, obviously. But if you have let's say you have Democratic control of both houses but then you have a Republican president, that complicates things. Or you have the Democrats who control one house, the Republicans control another house, and then the party of the president then also has to be taken account into the legislation. So the president has to sign off on bills produced by Congress, and so this adds a different dynamic to it. We'll get to that in a different video, but all of this just kind of goes to the key point that party control matters. So what I'd like to do is then talk about the ideology of members of Congress and then what that actually looks like with regard to voting behavior. This is a chart that's produced from the actual votes cast by House members in 2019. And I want to explain this chart because I'm going to be using it in the next slide as well in a way that's a little bit more detailed. So all the red dots are Republicans and all the blue dots are Democrats. Now I want you to look at this chart in terms of what's called the horizontal axis. Along the bottom line, you can see that there's a red line around this word economic redistributive. So this is every single vote taken in Congress in 2019 that has an economic dimension to it or some kind of a redistributive dimension, such as expansion of Medicare, expansion of welfare benefits, and so forth. So the key here is that this particular way of thinking about legislation in terms of the way that it relates to regulating the economy, managing the economy, or redistributing resources in the economy is the most important factor in terms of all congressional votes. And members of Congress are strongly organized along this particular way of viewing things, this particular ideological way of doing things. So on the left-hand side, you have liberal votes, and on the right-hand side, you have conservative votes. That dark line, the black line in the middle, is 0. So if you had a member, for example, who cast exactly half liberal votes and half conservative votes, they would be on that black line in the middle. If you had somebody who cast 100% liberal votes, they would be all the way over to the left side. A member who votes completely 100% conservative votes on these economic and redistributive votes, they would be all the way over on the right-hand side. So now we can see that Democrats kind of all cluster together in this on the liberal, moderate to liberal side, and all the Republicans tend to cluster together in kind of the moderate to conservative side, and there's nobody in the middle. So that's really important for us to understand. One more piece that I want you to look at is what's going on the vertical dimension. This is every other vote that's cast in Congress. So this could be any kind of a vote related to, say, environmental bills. It could be related to military spending. It could be related to everything else except for economic and redistributive policies. The liberal side here is on the lower side. Conservative votes are on the upper side. And you can see that Democrats are spread out all over the place in terms of all the other votes, as are the Republicans. They're just spread out very widely on this. So this goes to show you that the economic and redistributive, what we call dimension of congressional voting, is extremely important in terms of understanding them. Okay, so now we're going to take this and we're going to look at the behavior of the Democrats, and we're going to look at the behavior of the Republicans. Now, they're cohesive together as individual parties. We're going to look at this rate, this kind of ideology here in 2019, and then the next slide, we're going to compare this over changes that we've seen over the last 50 years. So I'm using my lifetime and my students' lifetimes. So first of all, we're going to look at what we have here. So up the top here, I've just replicated the slide from the previous slide. It's the same image. And the thing that I want you to notice here is those stars in the middle represent the exact 50% person, the median Democrat and the median Republican. Median is a mathematical concept that is the exact middle person. So looking again at 2019, we see that on a scale of -1, which is 100% liberal, to +1, which is 100% conservative, and that line in the middle is 0, that the Democrat median is -0.4, and the Republican median is +0.5, reflecting the fact that the parties are liberal and conservative respectively. Okay, again, no, not rocket science here. I'm just explaining this so that we can see what happens in previous years. Most of my students today were born sometime in the early 2000s, and so I think it's worth looking at what the Congress was like in the early 2000s. So here's the same chart produced with voting data on every single vote cast in Congress in the 2001 to 2003 congressional setting. And the stars represent the median Democrat and the median Republican. What we can see, first of all, is that unlike 2019, you see here in 2019, there are no moderates and there are no in either party. When we look here in 2001 to 2003, there are a handful of moderates. So here are a handful of Democratic moderates. Here are a handful of Republican moderates. The Democratic median is slightly less liberal. So it's negative 0.37 instead of negative 0.4. So it was less liberal. The Republicans were less liberal in 2001, or less conservative in 2001 and 2003. And you can see the changes. One of the big things that's happened is that the moderates are gone. There are no moderates who could compromise. So the Democrats who are up here, in this section up here, these are Democrats who on some economic and redistributive items could be counted on perhaps to vote with the Republicans. And these are Republicans down here who on occasion with regard to economic and redistributive matters could be counted on or at least potentially vote alongside Democrats. I was born in 1965, so now we can see what happened, what the political parties were like in 1965. First of all, the Democratic median is slightly less liberal. It's negative 0.34. So over time, we've seen that this star is moving farther and farther to the left. The Republicans were at positive 0.25, and we can see that the star, the median Republican, has also moved farther and farther to the right. Especially the big change is between 1965 and 2001. We can see a big jump there and then a smaller increase in becoming more conservative in the last generation. On top of that, we can see that there are lots of moderates in both parties. You've got a lot of Republicans over here who are in the moderate area, and you've got a lot of Democrats over here who are also that are in the moderate area. And you have a few members who are actually liberal. So you look over here, these Democrats here, these are Democrats on the economic and redistributive matters who are actually much more conservative than the bulk of their party. And you don't really see that same pattern with the Republicans. A few Republicans over here are more liberal on economic matters. But one of the big things that I want you to see here is that you have a lot of people in Congress, in the House of Representatives, in this middle moderate zone when I was a kid. When we look at when my students were born, we've got a lot fewer of them. And now we look at 2019 and they have completely disappeared from both parties. One other thing that I want to point out about this earlier slide is that there's a bunch of Democrats up here who are clustered in a particular way. So these are all clumped together on the conservative side of the ideological spectrum. And when we look at who these members are, these are all conservative Democrats, mostly from the South, all voting in a fairly unified way against civil rights legislation. Again, this obviously shows a big change in the Democratic Party between 1965 and even the early 2000s. Now, it's not just the House of Representatives where we see these changes. This is a different chart using very similar data. Again, this is looking only at, on the left-hand side here, we see the liberal conservative economic and redistributive dimension because that's the most important thing. It's the most useful for us for comparing members. I don't want to spend a lot of time dwelling on this, but I do want you to notice a couple of things. First of all, I'm shading here big changes during the 20th century. Here, the Depression era and World War II, and here the Civil Rights Movement era. And I'm highlighting these because they show important areas of change in voting behavior of members of Congress. The Blue line here shows the median ideology of Republicans over this time period. This stretches a long time from 1879 to 2015. And you can see that Republicans have been pretty conservative over that time period. They were much more conservative in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Then they became more moderate. This line going down shows that they became ideologically moderate. And then we see here that they become more conservative over the last 20 or 30 years. Democrats also show a sharp change. They started out fairly liberal in the 1870s. They became much more moderate to conservative as a party, really in a pretty unified way up through the middle of the Depression. Now, one thing I want you to see about the Democrats here is that it turns out to be important for us to notice the difference between Southern Democrats, who were largely opposed to civil rights legislation, and Northern Democrats, who are largely in favor of civil rights legislation. There's a big gap. There's a sharp difference between Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats through this time period, and that gap between Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats has gotten smaller over time. So then we look at what happened with the Democrats as they became much more liberal, much more moderate up until the Depression, World War II. And then once World War II started to come to a close, then the Democrats started to become much more liberal again. This occurred during the Civil Rights Movement. The Southern Democrats changed, but they're changing much more slowly in this time period. We see a big rapid change over the course of 20 years of Northern Democrats, who were the median Democrat was exactly in the middle ideologically. By the time you get to the late 1950s, early 1960s, Northern Democrats are quite liberal. This dark line here represents the Democratic Party as a whole. So we can see that over time, changes come, and it's related to what's going on in the political environment. So there are 3 takeaways that I want you to have for this particular slide. First of all, we see that Republicans are much more conservative now than they were during the Depression, and the changes for the Republican Party really kicked in the late 1970s. Sometimes Republicans get a bad rap as being opposed to civil rights, but during the Civil Rights Movement, they actually were not terribly opposed to civil rights. But what we see is that during this time period of the Depression and World War II, Republicans are, all the way through the civil rights and past the Civil Rights Movement, Republicans are fairly moderate for Republicans. But then beginning with the 1970s and the early 1980s, then we see the Republicans become much more conservative and have become much more conservative since then. So the Republican ideological change really occurs right around the time that Ronald Reagan becomes president. The Democrats became much more conservative between Reconstruction and World War II. So this is Reconstruction era post-Civil War. By the time you get to the end of World War II, Democrats were operating much more conservatively, and then they became much more liberal since World War II, and particularly during the Civil Rights Movement. This is a broad era of change for the Democratic Party. The same thing happens in the House of Representatives, but with a slightly different tack. The key takeaway here, again, Republicans are much more conservative. We don't see much change within the Republican Party in the House of Representatives that's related to civil rights legislation. This is not really what's driving their ideology. What we see with the Republicans is they became much more conservative following the election of Ronald Reagan and what political scientists have come to kind of understand as culture war issues. Southern Democrats became much more conservative after Reconstruction and through the end of the Civil Rights Movement, and then they slowly have become more liberal over time. The main change here in the House of Representatives is Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats, they've been pretty liberal since World War II. Southern Democrats have really only become more liberal since the late 1960s, since the end of the Civil Rights Movement. They've become much more unified in their liberalism. Finally, we can look at the differences between the parties in Congress. So each of these lines represents for the House or for the Senate how far apart are the political parties in terms of those medians. So we can see in this time period here between 1879 and the Great Depression, that there's a high level of especially through, say, the 1920 or so, there's a high level of difference between the political parties. During the Depression and during World War II, these lines slope downward. That shows a unifying tendency, that the differences are much smaller between the parties in that time period. And the differences then start to increase again after World War II is over. So this time of great political and economic unity, of crisis, this is all produces a level of unanimity and agreement between the parties. And then once the war ends, then we see differences that start to occur. I have 3 takeaways for this slide as well. First of all, we notice that the parties were quite different before the Great Depression, and then the differences diminished between the parties until the Civil Rights Movement. The second point is we've seen that the Civil Rights era changes that we see here, especially in the Senate, but to a lesser degree in the House of Representatives. From the previous slides, we saw that this is mainly a product of the Democrats becoming more liberal, because the Republicans' ideology is not changing during that time period. It's the Democrats who are becoming more liberal. Finally, we've seen that the changes that have taken place in this time period, the Democrats have become somewhat more liberal in this time period, but it's really the Republicans who have become much more conservative in this era. And so the huge differences that we are seeing between the political parties in the last 20 or 30 years are mostly, but not entirely, a function of Republicans becoming more conservative. So when we're talking about polarization, this is what we're referring to. We're referring to the gap between the parties, the Republicans in the House of Representatives becoming much more conservative in the Senate, and the Democrats becoming much more liberal. The gap between the parties, especially seen here in these upward sloping lines reflecting differences, those gaps dramatically increasing over time. That's polarization. The parties are growing farther and farther apart. At some point, they can't grow much farther apart, but as it is now, they are quite far apart. That's polarization. Again, because you have Republicans who produce conservative legislation, Democrats who produce liberal legislation, that means that the areas of compromise are much more difficult to find. If you're interested in the data for this, and you can find it for yourself, and it's free, and it's really interesting if you're kind of a data-minded person, if you like Excel, if you like graphing kinds of things, I got the data for this presentation from voteview.com. You can download it. The numbers themselves are called nominate data, and that's just an acronym that they use for describing the votes. But again, the great thing about this is it's not based on cherry-picked legislation. It's based on every vote cast in Congress. So it's really worth time. If you're kind of a geeky person, you kind of like looking at the numbers, this is something that's really interesting. Or if you want to find out your own member, your own district, how they vote, how they've been voting over time, I think that's really useful to know just in general as for citizens. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion about political parties in Congress and polarization, and that if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or post them in the comments section below.